Hello, and welcome to the part one of 4 videos that will prepare you to staff a disaster response call center. This training is designed for behavioral health professionals. My name is Andrea Chiroff. Our first module, it's important to kind of give you the overview of the purpose of the training. This is to prepare you to serve as a specialist within a unique call center. This call center is stood up at the time of aviation accidents and other mass casualty events, and our primary purpose is to represent the affected organization and provide information and support to survivors, survivor families, and victim families. That is kind of our general overall purpose. Here are our objectives. As a result of the training, we're going to talk about unique characteristics of mass casualty events. We're going to talk about and define the concepts of victim and family assistance. We're going to ultimately provide you the training so that you can process telephone inquiries for both actually aviation and non-aviation disasters and differentiate the processes involved in both. We will demonstrate for you some of the best practices in notifying families of a loved one's status, and ultimately, of course, prepare you to serve in this call center role. So part one, which you are viewing currently, provides an overview. We're going to talk about mass casualty events and a bit about trauma and people's reaction to it. Liken that to psychological first aid and victim and family assistance. And then finally, I'll conclude with an overview of the call center, some of its features and technology, both for voice and data. The second module will confine itself strictly to aviation disasters. Part 3 will be non-aviation disasters, and then part 4 will be a live demo for you to view in terms of practice entering data and processing a call simultaneously. This will also be a video for you to view before you take calls during an actual activation. So it'll be a good kind of refresher as to what's involved in not only using the database and the phone system, but how you process individual calls. So, as just a quick overview, Empathia as a company, we are a behavioral health care company. We've been around for a few years, and we are an EAP and work-life provider as well as disaster management. We're headquartered just outside Milwaukee in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and have a second office in Agoura Hills, California. We're not a large company. However, we have a very large network and provide services to about 350 organizations. That's in our EAP work. If we counted our disaster management client organizations, that number would be much higher. Basically, we have been doing the critical incident response work for several years, and among our client companies, probably average a case a day, where someone within a workplace has maybe died suddenly, or there's been an industrial accident, things of that nature. What we did is we took that experience and expanded upon it, and so we now have a department that's pretty much devoted to large-scale events. We refer to that as Black Swan, and Black Swan Solutions as a kind of a business unit within Empathia. A Black Swan in business continuity terminology is a low probability but high impact event, and we think that well describes the kind of work we do. Some of our principals have come to Empathia and brought with them many years of experience, and also were instrumental in developing this whole concept of a crisis call center and staffing it with behavioral health professionals. And actually that goes back to my work and our vice president's work back in 1997 actually. So we brought that to Empathia and combined with the critical incident response experience, have a program today that is very robust. Our goal is to provide the infrastructure and technology and staffing so that organizations, should they experience a large-scale event, be able to effectively and efficiently respond to those types of events in a compassionate and cost-effective way. These are some of the experiences that have shaped how we approach this whole endeavor. And as you can see, there are natural disasters, several aviation accidents, and obviously all being different. The one thing that definitely has been kind of the constant thread is this notion that what people definitely need and want and demand most in the aftermath of any kind of event, and it doesn't matter the type of the disaster, is information, and of course specifically information about their loved one. And so while that sounds simple and logical, organizations don't necessarily have the ability to account for every employee, or in this case perhaps every passenger, and that's where our challenge lies, in getting a process and resources together so that we can accomplish that goal. And so those are our goals with several different kinds of clients. As you can see, we work with airlines and cruise lines. We'll come back to this in more detail, but aviation and Amtrak as commuter rail, those are the only two industries that are legislatively required to have a victim and family assistance program and to prepare for these mass casualty events. Other types of business industry are not required. However, we are increasingly seeing that the model that was initiated by aviation really does not only make a lot of sense, but it is a very efficient way to respond. And so we have seen the adoption of this basic model applied in all sorts of industry. We serve about 1,200 colleges and universities through their insurer. We serve professional sports organizations. Some of our EAP clients, which represent banks, financial institutions, and insurers, which make our services available to organizations. So basically, it's a standby readiness to activate our services within 1 hour of being notified of a disaster. While we're waiting for those very infrequent notification calls to come, we're doing a lot of work directly with the client company in terms of helping them review their emergency response plan. We do a lot of training, and so therefore a lot of traveling, and participate in exercises and drills quite frequently. I would say probably averaging 2 drills per month. So at the time of a disaster, our response services include the crisis call center, which we're going to be focused our attention on. And then we also have in the field victim and family assistance services. And we'll talk about setting up a family assistance center and what that entails. And then finally, we do not provide directly, but we partner with another organization to assist in retrieving and returning victims' personal effects. And then finally, and especially because we are a behavioral health company, we look at any disaster as potentially having 2 very different affected populations. Perhaps it's those people sitting in the stadium or the employees of passengers on an airplane, but we also have the employee group that is associated with that organization. And anytime these things occur, we know from experience that employees will be fairly significantly impacted, and so one of our post-disaster services includes those individual and group debriefings at those companies. Just want to speak to you about the unique characteristics of these types of events. So think about losing someone that you love and then applying some of these characteristics to that situation. First of all, just in sheer volume, these events tend to be very violent in nature. You'll think back to the last aviation accident or the more recent Amtrak train derailment. The same kind of destruction that occurs to the fuselage of the aircraft and the train, unfortunately, also affects the people that were on board those vehicles. And so in many cases, there will be some fairly significant challenges in ultimately recovering, identifying a loved one. And so in some cases, families literally do not receive back any body for a funeral or memorial service to take place. And in fact, they may never get any forensic proof that a loved one has died as a result of that event. To compound things even further, these events are very media worthy, and so these families are going through a horrible, horrible loss in a very public forum, because the media, of course, is all about the human interest story and the tragedy behind the disaster. You may have survivor guilt at work in that because of so many people, there are certainly many cases where passengers could be sitting a row apart and one person survives the accident, the other one does not. And so overall, I want you to get that sense that this is not the usual loss. This is a very unique way of losing someone. There is that kind of combination of trauma and grief. And certainly, I would say that we're going to see the trauma reactions in the time frame in which we work with these families. The trauma will be much more prevalent than what we would think of as traditional grief reactions. And quite frankly, I've never seen the kind of prolonged and powerful disbelief that we've seen, for example, post 9/11, where the medical examiner in the city of New York and several of the authorities, as well as the employers that were represented in the two twin towers, got together and kind of came up with a way to create a means that families could get what's called presumptive death certificates. And basically it was the family attesting to the fact that this person had not been heard or seen since 9/11, and the same thing with the employer. And so they put that kind of process in place, and lo and behold, days and now weeks have gone by and nobody is applying for death certificates. Well, the reason for that is that they were absolutely not ready to think in those terms. Families hung on to hope for extreme periods of time, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And these were not crazy people. They were people that were hanging on to the, possibility that their loved one was still alive. There was much information about the restaurants and other establishments that were in the underground of the two towers, and so people had food and other things to sustain themselves, and it was simply a matter that they had yet to be rescued. And that was extremely profound, even for me and for our responders, to witness this extremely powerful denial that many, I would say most family members exhibited. So I want you to be prepared for some of that. Just a brief overview of typical reactions to trauma. You all know this. It will be something that will be part of the interaction with families in those first several days post-disaster. You will need to repeat information and of course try not to lose patience in doing so, because families may hear what you're saying, but they may not truly process information the way they normally would. Hearing people say that they feel numb or kind of going through the motions, very, very common. You may hear someone talk about shortness of breath. These are all very real and I would say not unusual reactions to trauma. So one of the things that we can do for people is to acknowledge that and to normalize some of those reactions as you're speaking with them. Because not only have they suffered a sudden loss, now they're scared about what they're physically and emotionally and cognitively dealing with, which can be just a horribly frightening situation. So psychological first aid is a term that's been around a while. Like medical first aid, you don't have to be a trained professional. And so this is very analogous to what is called victim and family assistance. And that term comes from the aviation disaster legislation. And if we look at it, the concept is very similar, and the way in which we provide assistance is very similar. So it's assisting people in a very human, basic way after these shocking or sudden events. It is not counseling, even though you are perhaps a clinician. We are not asking you to wear your clinician cap. This is not the time to be assessing family dynamics. It is this basic human support. And the guiding principles, as you can see, are to hopefully protect from secondary victimization or secondary trauma, always be direct but gentle, and one of our roles is to connect people with other loved ones, and of course information being so critical and so sought in the aftermath. And that's really what our goal and our tasks involve. So here are some of the core activities of psychological first aid. Again, this was taken right from the National Center of Traumatic Stress and the definition. And as you can read through that, it's very practical. It is meant to meet basic needs. And so if we look at that and compare to family assistance, here's a very simplified list of the things that we are trying to accomplish. And so if you'll see that providing information is at the top. People don't need counseling. People may be distraught, but those are all very normal reactions in this very unusual situation. And so our presence is not in a clinical or therapeutic mode, but rather basic human support. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, I need to tell you that the critical nature of this role is that the organization is going to be judged by victim and victim families' perceptions. In other words, you might very well be the very first interaction that this family has with, whatever the company is. And so you're going to play a very instrumental role in shaping those initial perceptions. And that's why we feel strongly about this training and, giving you or trying to give you a real good picture of what these responses look like. There are two primary types of inquiries that we talk about in the call center. As I said, the next module is going to pretty much focus on aviation. As I mentioned, there is legislation that mandates how families are treated, what kind of resources need to be in place, etc. And if you take the mantra from the intent of the legislation, it was very much about providing information transparently, accurately, and expediently. So tell what you know when you know it is kind of a catchphrase. For an aviation, or actually any kind of transportation disaster, we kind of are providing information and notifications on a rolling basis. First, we're basically telling someone that yes, your loved one held a reservation for this flight or this cruise ship. We then have confirmed that they actually boarded the flight. Just because you hold a reservation doesn't mean you actually got on board. And then finally, that notification process culminates with letting them know what has happened to their loved one. Are they, excuse me, are they uninjured? Are they injured and transported? Have they been transported to a local hospital? Or possibly if they've not survived the accident. And so that's the most difficult aspect of this whole role, and another task that we're going to try to prepare you for. After an aviation accident, the airline is required to set up a family assistance center, usually in or near the accident city, and pay for families to travel there, feed and clothe and provide other necessities to the families for what usually, or at least today, is averaging 5 to 7 days. In a non-aviation event, whether it's the bomb that goes off at a stadium or even a workplace fire or explosion, there's no regulatory mandate. And the other issue that makes these events even more challenging is that it's an open population. Now, with the exception, of course, of an employee work site. But think about, going to a ball game and 70 or 80,000 people and something happens. There's an expectation from those families that that organization is somehow going to be able to account for what has happened to each of those 80,000 people. That's really difficult. And so our role in that type of disaster is very different. We don't have a lot of information to give. We are essentially creating a possibly affected or missing persons list, and then over time cross-referencing that with other information from hospitals, from family members, so we can in fact help that organization shape what is an actual victim list. Very, very difficult. And if you remember, up until the first anniversary of 9/11, they were still tweaking that list. And so it's a very different, like I say, type of response. The organization is not required to set up the Family Assistance Center and all of those other requirements that we see in aviation. So let's talk a bit about the center. We know, as I've said, that the victims and the families are going to expect the organization to provide this accurate, timely information. But of course, most organizations don't have anywhere near these resources or infrastructure to handle that volume. 100,000 phone calls for an aviation accident is not unusual. 100,000. And that's because we're such a mobile society. You could have some inkling that your sister who works in Des Moines travels for her job, and you hear about an aviation accident in Des Moines, and you can't reach her on her cell phone. It is not unlikely that that person's going to pick up the phone and dial this toll-free number to try to see that her sister is okay. And so the call volume is quite staggering. We also know that media and employees will add to that volume. As we've said, we have a unique staffing model in that we only use mental health professionals. We have what's called a hosted telecom system, which allows you through the computer to answer the calls, and we link together anywhere from 60 seats to 160 or more seats into one toll-free number. And we don't have to understand how it works, but I assure you that the technology exists so that we can have remote, i.e. virtual call center specialists such as yourselves. As I mentioned, we need to be ready within 1 hour, which makes the benefit of having you either at home or at your office and able to log in quickly extremely valuable. The toll-free number that gets published in the media is the number that ultimately will lead to a caller speaking with a call center specialist. And before that, and I've used an aviation example here, they will hear an incident-specific message. This line has been established for those who believe they may know someone affected by this accident, which involved this airline and this flight number, which departed from such and such city, destined for this city, and then a bit about what happened. And so what we're doing is we're using technology to help defer calls that are not either being placed by affected people or other kinds of non-legitimate callers. And I don't mean legitimate in that, yes, they have a desire for information, but these are not the people that should be calling the toll-free number. And so there's menu options and verbiage that pretty much refers people or callers to other resources. And you'll see that when we get into the actual database. We also know that we'll get crank calls, and we have verbiage that will provide you the way in which to handle those calls. Our telecom software is called InContact. The beauty of this is you can use any phone device and computer. You're going to be getting your calls through the internet onto your phone. What that does, it is kind of, the capacity is fairly limitless in terms of the technology, and of course then we don't have to have lots of infrastructure and space with seats established. We do have 60 seats at our headquarters, but that's not nearly enough for most mass casualty events, and so that's why your interest in the program is so valuable. You'll have all the documents that remind you of some of these specifics, but suffice it to say that we're giving you the login, and we're pretty much providing you the way in which you need to log in to the phone system, and you make yourself available to take calls. Please don't let the technology, scare you off. It is very simple, as is our database, and we've designed it that way. We know that not all mental health professionals are tech savvy. We also know that in a crisis, we want to make the job as simple as we can. So our systems have to be easy enough and user-friendly enough for you to feel comfortable and jump in and not have to look through a bunch of documentation in order to remember how to answer the phone. So the inbound calls are going to ring on your phone device, and you can use a house phone, an office phone, or a cell phone. And you'll answer the call from the phone and hang up from that same device. For the database, and just to get you some terms here, remember our phone application is called InContact. So think of contact being a telephonic contact. Our database, we've nicknamed or put the acronym in place to have it reflect Disaster Information Management System. So we have trademarked it. This was developed in-house based on those 25 plus years of experience, and we think it is user-friendly and that this will be fairly easy for you to use. You don't need any special equipment. You're basically logging in, and we have different views for those aviation versus everything else type events. There is scripting to guide you through what data to collect and what to say. And the couple of terminology aspects that are worth mentioning is a client in the system is a possibly affected person, or in the case of transportation, the passenger would be known as the client, whereas the contact is essentially any person associated with that client. Here's the login, and you could actually do this as soon as the training is over. This is the URL, dms.neas.com. This is Disaster Management Services. This is a former name of our former company name, National Employee Assistance Services. Anyway, that's the URL. So your username is basically your first initial with your full last name. So I am A. Chiroff. Your password has things in common. The first two letters are capital E, capital D. The last two letters are capital M, capital S, and an exclamation mark. These are the things that make you unique, the 4 digits that you submitted on your application. So you have a unique password compared to the other specialists. When you log in, the first thing you'll see at the very top menu bar is the client that's been affected. This little icon here, it looks like almost a bubble, a conversation bubble, is an instant message location. Instant messaging will be primarily between you and the management team. We have virtual call center managers that will be working with you throughout the process, and so they can individually message you, versus this is a board that you'll see on the primary screens. And think of this as kind of the master information board. This is going to have information in it that applies to everybody, and it's kind of information that we want to get out there to the entire responder population. So you'll have 2 kind of electronic means of communicating. This, of course, is where you're going to log out at the end of your shift. And this little thing is a refresh button, this kind of half circle. I'm going to go into the My Account area, which has quite a bit of information in it. I would highly recommend that you spend some time in there. You're going to want to become familiar. The first far left is actually where you clicked on to view these training videos. The next tab says phone login. So at the time of an activation, if you have forgotten what your unique phone login happens to be, you can come right here and that's going to be available to you. There are also going to be documents that apply to the telephone piece of a response. So all of those materials will be housed right here in that section. There's this section that has a lot of the paper forms that now we don't need to use, but they're there as backup and as reference. This is a section that we would want you to click on and look at. That's going to have that video, short video that will remind you, how to process both aviation and non-aviation calls, and really will just kind of refresh your memory. We realize that this is not something you're going to think about every day. We do need to kind of keep your training current, and so we think that a couple of times a year to refresh kind of your familiarity with the systems is really what's needed to ensure that we're all appropriately prepared. This is the main screen. As you see, there's really only 3 sections that would be available to you and that you need to worry about. The first one is a dashboard that's going to give you the basic incident information. When we activate our call center responders, you're not going to get details about the client, organization, exactly what happened. Our goal is to be as efficient and expedient as possible. So we're basically asking you, are you available? And you'll get the information when you log in. This is a section you will spend in order to look at travel itineraries. Those are for those families that are going to travel to the Family Assistance Center. This is the section you're going to spend most of your time in, and I'll show you more detail about this. So manage client lists. Remember, client being the affected person. And then at a point in the process, and you'll be apprised of this, this is going to become relevant when you become assigned to a client family. And there will be details in there. For example, John, please go look at your My Client section for an update as to the itinerary developed for this family. So this is another place where person-specific information will be provided to you electronically. In the client management section, the first tab is event/incident info, just like it sounds. This is the incident details. You may want to print the page. It's going to give you the location of the incident, the description, the date, the time, the toll-free number that is being used. All of our clients have a unique individual toll-free number. It'll be important for you to know what that number is, because in inviting a caller to call you back, you want to provide them with the main phone number plus your extension. It also gives you information about what to do if someone is inquiring. One of the consistents is that if people do call to offer help, and we're going to refer them to their local Red Cross. The second section of this is that Manage Client List, and as I said, this is where you're going to spend the large majority of your time. In our training scenario, we use this particular event because it allows us to practice both aviation and non-aviation calls. So Blue Sky Airlines aircraft Flight 999 crashed into the Galleria Mall. And as such, Blue Sky Airlines is going to be responsible for not only assisting the passengers and families on board the aircraft, but also the victims on the ground and the property damage that was created because of this accident. And so you see that this is kind of the overall incident. This is like the umbrella, but there are 2 very different populations that we will be speaking with, and that's where you need to select the appropriate event. So an incident has at least 1 event. In most cases it would be named the same thing. In this case we have 2 events, and depending on who you're speaking with, you would select that appropriately. So as I mentioned, scripting is going to provide you a lot of the guidance that you need to walk through the process. And so it has the greeting for you. Notice we do not say hello or good morning or good evening. Those terms can be very offensive. So you're starting out by saying, you have reached the Blue Sky Airlines Family Information Line for Flight 999. My name is Andrea. Could you please provide the last name of the person you believe may have been on board? Now, that greeting has been designed in a certain way for a reason. Instead of saying, how may I help you, which really leaves the door very open to the caller really to kind of say anything, we need to be strategic about this, because most calls are going to be, callers will be unaffected. We need to get at, as best and as quickly as we can, those that actually have a loved one on board this aircraft. And so we're asking them specifically for that person's name. And you're going to click in the radial button as to that particular situation. So let's say the caller does not provide you a name. Instead, they're wanting media information, or they say, there's no way I'm getting on board an aircraft next week. I need to cancel my reservation and get my money back. Or just general curiosity seekers, or as I mentioned, those crank calls. So you click in those radial button and then you end the call, and all of your verbiage is right there to provide. They may be calling about a crew member. So for aviation, the airline really almost always deals with the crew member families. So we're just collecting information about the crew and indicating to the caller that we're going to forward that to the appropriate flight department or the in-flight department in the case of a flight attendant, and that they will be providing information and contacting the caller. The final choice here was to place a follow-up call. And just to mention to you, this is kind of the two versions of the main screen. This refers to the fact that if you are in the basic view, you are seeing that scripting that we just we're going to walk through in just a minute. In order to get to the advanced view, which you'll want to do after you get assigned a family. In other words, you don't need the scripting anymore. You're kind of out of the intake process at that point. In fact, you'll log out of the inbound phone line. Once you get your assignment, there's no need for you to continue to take, other inquiries. You really focus then on that family or families that you've been assigned. So I'm giving you an example here as to just a real quick aviation example. Here's your greeting. You're asking the person, could you please spell that name for me? And you want to only enter the first initial of the last name. And also we're suggesting the first initial of the first name. And here's why. If there's any spelling variance and you put the whole name in, it's going to give you a false negative. So we suggest that by doing this and clicking the search button, the system is going to display for you everybody's last name that starts with an A and starts with the G. So the criteria of what you put in is going to be displayed. And of course, this is the person that the caller was concerned about, Gomez Adams. So you click on the name, and then from there, you're basically asking questions. Now, before you get into the bolded italic verbiage, you're asked to enter your name and your extension number. And then you devote your attention to the caller. You're asking for their last name, their first name. Don't be afraid to ask for spelling. We want to make sure that those are captured appropriately. We're asking for the caller's middle name. That has to do with the fact that we're going to need that to book them, possibly book them travel. And so we collect that on the inbound call. We also need to collect a phone number, the best phone number to reach that caller. You want to make sure that you repeat back the number so you know you've accurately captured those digits. Ask if it's a cell, home, or work number. Enter marital status and gender. The date of birth. Now, some callers may not know. Don't take a guess. Leave it empty if the caller is not absolutely sure. That's kind of the best practice regarding date of birth. If you don't know that they're traveling with anybody else, that's one of the options. You would put the name of the person. If the caller said, yes, I think he's traveling with his daughter, you'd put the name of the daughter here. And the last question is, how are you, caller, related to Gomez Adams, the passenger? It's always related to the caller's relationship to the passenger. And this pull down has, oh gosh, probably 35 different possibilities. In this case, I put daughter, which means that he or she is a family member. Now, I have to also give you this overview for aviation accidents, and pretty much applied to any disaster. The intent of the legislation was that the definition of family, first of all, was not provided, and so the intent was for the organization to adopt a very inclusive definition of family. So not just relationships by blood or legal proceedings, but also relationships of emotional significance. So, for example, a girlfriend or a fiance does not have any sort of legal status, but for purposes of family assistance, that person is going to be considered family. So here's that little definition if you click down the question mark. And so it's up to you to determine if the caller meets that definition or doesn't. In this case, the daughter would certainly meet the definition. And then here is your verbiage for notification, and that will all depend on what is known at the time of that call. So here we have, according to the boarding documentation, Gomez Adams boarded flight 999, and unfortunately that aircraft was involved in an accident today. I'm afraid I have some very difficult news to provide. I am so sorry to have to tell you that the authorities at the scene are reporting that no survivors have been found. And on behalf of Blue Sky Airlines, you have my deepest sympathy. Now, and it goes on to talk about the Family Assistance Center briefly. We know that people at that point probably, they're not going to hear or process much what you say after that. But I just want to make one comment, and that is, while the scripting is there for you, the trick is not to sound scripted in giving these messages. And that's where some practice comes in. The Safety Board, the NTSB is the National Transportation Safety Board. They investigate all rail, aviation, and cruise line accidents, as well as bus. So they will be involved in any kind of response. So you can read through that and get a feel for the fact that we're not only notifying the family, but we want to make sure that they don't have any immediate needs. We also want to make sure that they have your name and your extension number. And so if you're providing information about that passenger's physical status, that means that you have been assigned to them. And as I said, your number will be the extension of whatever toll-free number is being used. And of course, want to indicate that you're sorry for their loss. Years ago, that's one of the reasons we have the legislation for aviation is I think airlines were told by the lawyers primarily that you can't say you're sorry because that somehow infers culpability, and that's really not what we're talking about. You're extending your sympathies to another human being for their loss. So details regarding both the aviation disaster and the cruise lines and then non-transportation type calls will be discussed in detail within modules 2 and 3. Your interest in participating in this unique program is very much appreciated, and we recognize these events don't occur very often, but when they do, it really is kind of all hands on deck, and we really need to maintain this continuous preparedness. So thank you. We appreciate your interest, and we hope that you continue in terms of training and the next video. Thank you again.